city to try and protect it from the enemy from being sunk. So, I still don't really understand how he came up with this, because he did this before really there were computers. So they were developing computers at the same time that he was developing this idea. Of course, since sort of the 80s, this kind of optimization technique is solvable for extremely large problems. Has anyone heard of NP hardness? Anyone here have like a computer science background? No. So a lot of the math that we use is actually not solvable in our lifetime. And that means that these are called very hard problems. And theoretically, the problems you want to put in a microphone. Okay. So theoretically, an awful lot of optimization is what they call NP hard, which means it's going to be very difficult to solve. And the most basic model, linear programming, even that was considered NP hard and very difficult to solve until along came a guy called Karl Marker in the 80s, and he found a slightly different way of solving it that is polynomial. So in other words, it solves in polynomial time. So you can solve hundreds of millions of variables using this method, which makes it extremely useful. Okay? Towards the end of this class, I'm going to talk to you about the assumptions that lie behind it and show you once you start breaking some of the very simple assumptions here, then you actually end up with another non-polynomial NP hard problem. Okay? But the DEA, the model that we're talking about, that is indeed all based on linear programming. Okay. So my field is called operations research. Okay? And another term for it is management science. And that's what all the big unions that we have, this is what they're called. So Informs is the American community, which stands for OR and management science, and it's got about 12,000 members, sort of internationally. What we have here is a framework, the heart of which is the mathematical model. But it's only one part of the story. That's what I want you to remember. Okay? Let's say you're working as a consultant, or you're working in-house, and you figure that your company has a problem. Normally, 50% of the work is to observe the problem to be solved, because the management will come and say, well, I think we have this problem. And by the time you've conversed with a whole bunch of the board, or even the second level, you discover that the problem is actually somewhere else entirely. So it's a lot of work just to figure out exactly what the problem is. And that's the first stage. And after you've figured out what the real question is, then you have to observe the system and collect the data that is relevant to the problem that you're thinking about. And then we formulate a mathematical model. For example, a linear program. And quite often there might be sub-problems involved in that. So you could think about working for a logistics company or for a bus company that collects children and takes them to school. Should be a fairly simple problem. And you have your children located at the street corners of various locations, and you need to take them to the various set of schools. And you want to do this with minimum resources, so minimum number of buses, minimum number of drivers, but such that the kids get taken to the right school, it's a good start, and on time for the first class, right? Okay, so that would be a mathematical problem that you would define. Mathematical problem includes an objective function, which is what you are trying to achieve. There's actually only two sorts, so that keeps it simple. You're either maximizing something, such as profits or revenues, or the happiness of your customers, okay? Or you're minimizing something, such as cost, such as risk, such as failure, okay? And once you've done that, you need to make a choice about your decision variables. Okay, simplest model, you have one decision variable, right? But in the real world, you're never going to have one. You're going to have a series of decisions that you're trying to make. And once you have an objective function defined in terms of your decision variables, so it's a profit function, okay, and your decision as a carpenter is how many chairs, how many tables, how many doors to make, and you've collected the information, for example, on the profit or contribution to fixed costs and so on, taxes, in your objective function, you then have a subject to, because in the real world we live in a world of constraints. But there's an entire different course here called Theory of Constraints. Okay, it's all about how you define what we're using here. So it will be subject to a whole series of constraints on your decision variables. And then you want to try and solve it. Okay, and you want to use it to predict or analyze. And you have to remember that it's not the actual specific number. It's not that you get 202.3567, that is of interest. Okay, what is of interest is to get insight into your problem, to understand the trade-offs between making the tables and making the doors. You only have a limited amount of resources. Okay, and once you've used the resource here, you can't use it over there. Okay, and you have demand constraints, and not only production and supply constraints. Okay. So once you've understood, got some insight into your problem and probably the magnitude of the sizes, so approximately how much you want to produce of one versus the other, you then have to do a lot of what they call sensitivity analysis. So you play with the parameters of your model. What you assumed that your profit would be this, but of course it's not only dependent on you, it's also dependent on the competition. Exactly, the market, bull market, bear market, good times, bad times, okay. Whether you want to in fact sell a set of tables and chairs and how much you would price those. So you need to do a lot of sensitivity analysis to make sure that you have all of your parameters correct or the results are fairly stable. You want a robust set of results. You're going to choose the optimal alternative. You have to present that. That's one of the hard parts. That's why we have in all of these courses a point where you present your work. Because just to think about how to present it is not simple. When I use math, I would never show any math to any manager because there's no point. Okay? You have to present the results graphically and use tables and charts and pretty pictures. They're worth 1,000 words, seriously. But it's not always simple to figure out how to do that. Because the hardest part, the part that hurts the most, is point number 7. To get that company to implement what you just suggested. Okay? And there have been times, and I could sit here and cry, okay, where I've worked on projects and we've given them the results and they've opened the drawer, put the results in the drawer and closed it. Told me I'm not allowed to talk about it. Okay? So I did some work for the Civil Aviation Authority in my country, looking at what would be the impact of opening the skies between my country and Europe. And opening the skies means that the regulators stop telling the airlines when they can fly and how often they can fly, or even at what price, and to have a free market. And the problem was that I did this work, and you could see that this would be excellent for the consumers, and actually for the companies in my country. So we have a very high-tech based industry. It's worth about 20% of our GDP today. And obviously the markets are not in my country, because my country has 8 million people and it's a tiny little dot in the middle of the Middle East. Okay, the markets are everywhere else. So Waze it's in Peru, right, and in many countries. So they need to get to their customers. So they need to travel a lot. And if we can make aviation or air travel much cheaper, we can actually help these companies to develop more by minimizing their cost. But it was likely, or it's very likely, that my home airline is going to go bust in the process, or bankrupt. And they didn't want me to say that out loud, because I could actually accelerate that process. So I did help them to actually do it, and they in fact opened the skies, and the demand has increased by 2. So that's really exciting, and it's pretty much what we forecast. And we showed them the prices came down in the region of 20-25%, and the frequencies went up massively. But you don't always get to implement stuff because there's a lot of politics, and in my math models, I don't know how to model politics. And I think that you guys understand that as well as I do, right? Yes. Okay. So this is the process, and this is actually what we do with DEA as well. Okay, we start with a question, we develop that question, we have to figure out what are the variables, and that's sort of what we talked about yesterday. What are the variables that are most relevant to this story? We're going to now develop the mathematical model and come up with some results, and then we have to show whoever it is we're advising what we would suggest they do in order to improve. Okay? And normally it's an ongoing process. So if you're working with a company or an organization, you want them to put all of this into place and to continuously collect the data and information, and thus be able to provide targets for bonuses on an annual basis, using something objective and less subjective. But also recognizing that there's an awful lot of politics that are going to bother us on the way. Okay, so the next step here is I'm going to take an absolutely simplified example, simply to talk you through how you build a linear program. Okay, so here we have the glass company. It has 2 products. Okay, and we're going to assume it also has 2 machines. It's as simple as I can make it. And we need to collect information, the data that we need to know in order to maximize their profits. Okay, is how much time it takes to produce each product on each machine. Okay, so we learned that to produce product 1, we need 2 hours on machine A. Okay, product 2 doesn't need the first machine. And we also learned that next week we will have 10 hours on machine A. Then we have machine B, and product 1 needs 1 hour per unit, and product 2 also needs 1 hour per unit, which means that now we have a story where we have to share resources. Okay? And again, we have another 10 hours on this machine that have opened up next week. Fine. So the last piece of information here is how much profit we make. So supposedly we're making 4 solé on product 1 and 2 on the second product. So if we're looking to maximize profits, what are we going to produce? Absolutely. So first of all, we're going to try and produce as much of product 1 as we can. Assuming, let's at the moment, that there's demand for as much as we could theoretically produce. Okay. But product 1 is restricted here. How much of product 1 can we actually produce? That's correct. But they can, and they can work, let's say, simultaneously. It's not, let's assume we have work in progress so that everything's working continuously. Fine. So now, how much can we produce? How much did you say? Just speak louder. 15. 15. Why?
You need 1 hour of machine C for product 1, so it means 10 items.
Yes.
Yes, right. From product 1, you need 5 hours in machine A, right? I'm sorry, 5 products in machine A. Okay, so it means 10 plus 5.
No, so it doesn't quite work like that, okay? They're each individual constraints. So the tighter constraint is the one that will most bind us, okay? So you're absolutely correct. On machine A, we can produce 5 units, and that's the most that we could produce, okay? So if that's the most that we can produce, given this story, we still have another 5 hours on machine B. So in fact, in this story, we could theoretically produce both products. Exactly. Okay, so now we're going to go from this to a bunch of equations. Okay, because this is an easy problem, right? And when you have 100,000 of them, okay, you're never going to be able to see it. Okay, so in this story, we have two variables to start with. We have product 1 and product 2, and these are the decision variables. Okay, so P1, P2, P1 is going to equal the number of product 1 to produce. P2 is the same thing, but just of product 2 to produce. Okay? When you define your decision variables, you need to also understand what the unit is, what it means. If P1 equals 3, what does that mean? Okay? So let's say, you know, all of this information is in tons. So P1 equals 3 tons of product 1 that we would produce. Okay, and after we define our decision variables, then we're going to define our objective function. We have two choices. We're going to maximize or we're going to minimize. Waze is always minimizing, right? The shortest path, the least time, or the least distance, so on. In this case, we're going to maximize our profits. Okay, so maximum what? Yep, I need everything in terms of my decision variables. Okay, and how am I going to write that? Maximize. Okay, so I'm going to take the profit that I expect to earn per unit, per ton of product 1, and I'm going to say 4 times P1. So if I produce 3 units of P1, I make 12 units of profit. Okay? But it's not the only thing that I can do. I can also produce P2. And if I produce 1 unit of P2, I earn how much? Exactly. So it's going to be plus 2 P2. And then my objective function takes into account how much I can produce of P1 and how much of P2 and the total profit. This equals profit. If I produce nothing, I'll make nothing. My decision variables have to be strictly non-negative. That's an underlying assumption of all of the models. I cannot produce anything minus. Okay? So now we've defined our objective function. We have to tell the model what are our constraints. We've got 2 constraints in this story. The hours per machine. So each constraint is going to define a machine. So we write subject to. We want to use the first constraint.
Whatever we're doing in machine A first, and then with that
just start with machine A.
Okay.
Just with machine A. Okay. So what do we know about machine A? You've already solved it. Now take one step back and tell me, how did you get there?
10 hours available.
Yes.
Divided by 2 products. That's why.
Okay, so that's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it before you do your division is you say 2 times P1. Every unit of P1 is going to waste 2 hours. And that has to be less than or equal to exactly my resources. So this is constraint 1, and it is for machine A. Now you give me the second constraint. Go for it, Ivan. Go on, you were there? No, you're not willing to. Juan. Perfect. So P1 plus P2 is less than or equal to 10. Why don't I write equal to 10? I want to use up all my resources, no? No. No. I want to minimize my use of resources. And it might be that one constraint means that I can't use up all of the resources of another constraint. Therefore, it's normally less than or greater than. Okay, and not, we try to avoid equalities. They're much harder to solve. They reduce the space of solutions. Okay, so we're nearly done. All we have to do is add that P1 and P2 are greater than or equal to 0, always non-negative, and we have a closed mathematical problem. Can we solve that problem? Actually, no. It's really annoying, right? I'm being very annoying, I'm sorry. So if you go back to high school and you think about all those simultaneous equations that you solved, you remember those? Okay. How many equations do you need for, say, 5 unknowns? If you have 5 unknowns, in other words, 5 decision variables in our story, how many equations would you need to solve it? Louder. 5! You would need 5. You need as many equations as there are unknowns. And you'd need an equality. So I've just told you never use equalities, because they're very annoying. Okay? But in fact, to solve this problem, you have to make it an equal sign. Okay? So there's another magic part of this story. If I want to change 2P1 less than or equal to 10 to equal to 10, it might be okay, right? P1 might be equal to 5 and everything's good. But what happens if, because of other constraints, P1 equals 0? What would I need to do? I'd need to soak up the left-hand side so that it still equals the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is add another variable, and we'll call it a slack variable. And we'll actually have a slack variable for every single constraint. Okay? And then, if P1 equals 5, our slack equals 0, right? And we know that this constraint is binding. It's a very important constraint. If we could change that constraint, we could maybe produce more. Okay? Whereas if P1 is equal to 5, oh, that's what I just said, right? Sorry. If P1, for example, equals 1, okay, our slack equals 8, and we know that we haven't used all of the hours on machine A for these products. So we've also learned a lot of information. And we will have a slack variable for every single one of our constraints. So now we don't only have P1 and P2, but we'll also have slack 1 and slack 2 in this case. And they also need to be greater than or equal to 0. And now we have 4 variables in our mathematical model, but only 2 constraints. Okay? And now we have a different problem, which is 2 unknowns, 2 constraints. That's fine. If we have more variables, then 2 out of these 4 variables have got to equal 0. That will be the assumption of all of our mathematical programs, and thus we can solve them. And I'll show you how to solve them in a second. But is it clear? The story's clear. We can understand where are the bottlenecks in our model, and how we can define an entire system using this kind of math. Okay? So I'll put that down, put this up. This is confusing. Okay. So this is exactly what we just drew on the board. Okay? This is the objective function, and normally, for some reason, we call the value of our objective function z. That will be a single number. Okay? We talk about the parameters in our objective function as being c's. This is a vector, 4 and 2 in this case. Okay? And this, in our case, are the profits per unit. It could be anything. It could be time. It could be units of utility, whatever is relevant to your model. Subject to, and then we're going to have our constraints. Our variables have to be non-negative. Okay, and there I've tried to define exactly what I'm talking about. This exists in all mathematical models. Doesn't matter whether it's linear, non-linear, integer, whatever you want. Okay, this is always the story. You start with your decision variables. Sometimes they're easy to define, and sometimes they're the hard part. You have your objective function and your constraints. This should be the other way around. I apologize. Start with the objective function. That's the simplest way of doing it, okay? Decision variables, objective function, and then you get to your constraints. Okay, so what we've actually done here is create a model that we need to solve. And that's an entirely different story, and that's where Danzig comes in. So I'm going to try and clean this board. Yes. So I purposefully chose an example that has two variables because I can draw two variables, right? So here we have, I won't call it x1, I'll call it product 1. And here we have product 2. And when it comes to drawing, what we're going to start with is our constraints. Okay, so we start with let's assume that they're equal. So 2x1 equals 10, or x1 is equal to 5. Or product 1 equals 5. And then we have to figure out which side of this constraint is the side that would meet our constraints. Okay, so we can produce nothing up to 5. And then we have P1 plus P2 has got to be less than or equal to 10. How would I do that? You know how to draw stuff, right? That's not an issue. You just take one of them. So this is my 10, and here's my 10. I have a pretty graph here. P1 plus P2 is equal to 10. 0, 0 suits it, and so I'm going to be left with this area, because they always have to be strictly non-negative. And what we have here is what's called a feasible set. Any point inside this feasible set does not break a constraint. And so it's a possible production set, or technology set, like we talked about yesterday. And somewhere in this set is the optimal solution. It could be that we have so many constraints that there's in fact no feasible set. So there is no optimal solution. That's one potential answer to this model. It could be that there is one optimal solution. And that's what we're looking for. And the third choice is that there are multiple optimal solutions, in which case it's always an infinite number of optimal solutions. And some people say that's kind of annoying, because then how do you know what to advise your manager or the company that you're consulting with? I look at it slightly differently. I would say if you have multiple solutions, that gives them the space to choose what they want. And that can also be advantageous. You just have to know how to explain it. Okay, so let's assume for the moment the simple case where there's one optimal solution. At the moment, there's an infinite set of possibilities. Where will this optimal solution be? So let's think for a minute about the objective function. Okay? We could also draw that. 4x1 plus 2x2, or 4p1, that's what we kept calling it, I apologize. Okay? 4p1 plus 2x2 plus 2p2 equals, and the point is that we don't know what it equals, so it's equal to a question mark. So let's just take a number and try and draw it. Simple 1, 4. Okay, at the moment, 4p1 plus that's, of course, what we don't know. I just made up a number. Okay, why? Because it's easy. This is my objective function. And for anyone who studied economics, it's sort of the equivalent of an indifference curve. It's just a linear indifference curve. And it can move. What doesn't change is the slope of the line. So I can move it. And this is a maximization problem. So, provided I'm making profits from everything, the further I push it out, the more profit I'm making. Okay, because I could make 4p1 plus 2p2 equals 8. Okay, and then it would kind of look like this. 8's better than 4, right? Because it's profit. And I will keep pushing that line out, and the very last point that I touch from the feasible region, so I'm not breaking any constraints, will be the one that gives me the maximum profit in this case. And what's beautiful about this story is that it will always be an extreme point. So in this case, it will be here. And that's how we started the class, right? We said, oh, yeah, what would we want to do? We'd want to produce 5 units of P1, because it's the maximum we can because of the first constraint. And we can still produce some P2 since we have a little bit more resources on that second machine, and we only need the second machine for the second product. Okay, so we can also produce 5 units of the second product, and that will give us the optimal profit. So here it is. We can call it now Z star. Z was the value of the objective function, and when we use a star, we're indicating that we found the optimal solution. 20 plus 10, it's going to be equal to 30, I believe. But Mariella's going to check me. Okay? Does that make sense? So the beautiful part of this story is we don't need to check the whole of the feasible region. We only need to look at each of the external points. So in fact, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 in this story. And that's another way of looking for the solution. And that would be what we would call a greedy algorithm. We could look at every extreme point and search for just choose the one that gives us the highest value. You see, I even wasted my evening trying to do graphics here, you see. It's beautiful, right? Admit it? Yes. Yes. Okay, so first of all, that's a lot of questions. Absolutely. So what I was showing you, first of all, was in a maximization problem, we would be pushing out as far as possible. Okay. In a minimization problem, we would be pushing in. Okay. But there's only two choices, so it's very simple. But this is just to be able to explain what's going on. Okay. To actually solve this big-sized problem, we can't just draw it, sadly. We can't play around with slopes when we have millions of variables. So the actual algorithm that we could use to solve this problem would be one where we look at only the extreme points, because it's guaranteed to be on an extreme point. It's because it's also all linear. Okay? And a greedy algorithm would simply check every single point. Okay, and what Danzig came up with is something called the simplex algorithm. You know the word algorithm? Yes, because we have a model, a mathematical model, and we need an algorithm. That's how to solve it, right? Okay. So the simplex algorithm is even smarter than the greedy algorithm that I just described. It starts at a point. So for example, we could start at 0, 0. What's happening at 0, 0? What's happening at point A? We actually have zero profit, right? Okay, so I'm running out of space here. So at point A, we can say product 1 equals product 2 equals 0. So where did all those 10 hours in machine A and machine B go? They went into the slacks. So if we call it slack A, it's going to equal to slack B, it's going to be equal to 10. And overall, the value of our objective function at point A is 0. Because we're not producing anything. Okay, so if I keep it way up here, Z is equal to 4P1 plus 2P2. Yeah, 0 plus 0 is still blooming 0. That's no good, right? Okay. Now we have to move from point A to another point. And we will do it basically arbitrarily. But let's say we go from A to D. What happens at point D? Exactly. So P2 is now equal to 10. P1 equals, stays at the same place. Okay. SA. The slack in the first machine. It stays at 10, right? Because we're not producing anything from the first product. So SA is equal to 10 like P2. SB is equal to 0 like P1. We moved from one extreme point to another extreme point, and what we actually did was swap two values. P2 went from 0 to 10. Slack B went from 10 to 0. That's all we did. We just swapped two values. And we know we have two constraints. Only two variables can have a positive value. Precisely two variables will have a positive value, provided there's a feasible region. Okay, so we move to this next point. It's part of our algorithm. It's an iterative algorithm. And we ask ourselves, is this a good place to be? And how do we know that? We go back to our objective function. What happened to Z? I'll call this ZA. So what happens to ZD? 20 points. 20 units. We're making 10. They're valued at 2 per unit. Our objective function increased. This is a good thing because we're maximizing, and therefore we move from A to D. Okay, can we stop? Not necessarily. Hi. Okay, so we need to look at the next closest point. Okay, this is what we will do. So now we go to C. And at point C, we have P1 equal to P2, or A and B, or whatever we called it, equal to 5. What happened to our slacks? So this said 2P1 is less than or equal to 10. In other words, 2P1 plus slack A has got to equal 10. P1 equals 5. 0. And it had to be 0 because we actually already have two variables with positive value. Two constraints, two positive values. The others have to be 0. It's a requirement. We're talking math here. It's simple. Okay? So P2 was 10. It still stays a positive number. But it's just a bit smaller because it's given up some of the resources to produce P1, which was 0 and is now also 5, positive. And the slack variable that was positive is now 0. Two variables with positive values, two variables equal to 0. What happened to the value of our objective function? 30. Yes? 30. Is this a good thing? Hell yes. This is good because we've gone from 0 to 20 to 30 and we're maximizing. Can we stop yet? No, because we still do not know if the next point is going to give us more profit. Okay? And so we would have to, for example, check B. At point B, we are producing 5 units of the first product and none of the second product. This means that the slack in the first variable is going to be 0. But for the for the first machine, for the second machine, we're only using up 5 hours. Okay, so the slack for the second machine is 5. And now our ZB equals 5 times 4, 20. That means that the value started to drop. And the point of simplex is, as long as the value keeps going up, we continue searching for the optimal solution. The moment it drops, we can stop. In this case, we ended up checking all of our extreme points. But normally, in very large problems, we're going to save a lot of work by using simplex over the greedy algorithm that would check all extreme points. Okay? So it's a very, very smart algorithm that solves very large problems in seconds. Okay, at least today with the computers that we have today. Once upon a time, my teacher who first taught me this material told me that he looked at the agricultural policy of India at the time to try and figure out where to grow rice and where to grow wheat, given the weather conditions. India is not a small place. Okay, and he was able to then, and we're talking 20 years ago because I'm that young, that he was able to solve it at that time. Okay, so you could almost look at agricultural productivity across the globe, certainly for Lima, to try and figure out, given water conditions and all of the other climatic questions, the amount of fertilizer you need, where your land is, and so on, what would be an optimal policy if there were no politics? Which, of course, there are not, so life is easy. Okay, this is the idea of this problem. That's all it's doing, is it's checking extreme points, which means basically where the constraints are equal, okay, and finding for you where are the bottlenecks and what is the optimal solution. Okay, so here we go. If you look at any books or any papers on this topic, this is the standard way of writing it. So xj are your decision variables, z is the value of your objective function, bi is the right-hand side. Those are your constraints. So this would be the 10 hours that we have on each machine. Okay? So it's also going to be a vector of all of the right-hand sides of all of your constraints. Cj are the parameters that you see in the objective function. It means that you have to know what are the profits per unit. And for example, we were talking about farming. Okay? You're trying to figure out what to plant. You're only going to be able to sell it next year. You don't actually know what the value of your products will necessarily be, because it kind of depends on, well, was it a good year with weather? Was it a bad year? Is there a lot of, if you've planted a lot of bananas, then maybe you make less, and so on. Okay? For linear programming, you have to use a number. You cannot say, I don't know, and put in a question mark. It won't work. Which is why you start talking about sensitivity analysis around those values. If it goes up 20%, what happens? Would all of my decisions completely change? Would I stop growing bananas and only grow papaya? Okay, these are the kinds of questions that you want to ask yourselves when you're running such a model. Okay, so B is the right-hand side, you have to know it. C is the objective function vector, in our case 4 and 2. And then Aij is actually the left-hand side, that matrix that defines the constraints. Fortunately, normally those are better known than most other things. So create slightly less issues. And this is how you see it in a mathematical form. So this is a matrix for those that like math, and this is in vector form. They're equivalent. Okay. But that's the standard form of the model that we just solved. Okay. And as I said before, okay, we're normally going to try and use greater than or less than. You can't solve that. You have to put it into standard form, and that means you're always going to use slacks. And slacks are very useful information, okay? Because then you also learn something called dual pricing. So you can learn not only how many of product P1 versus P2 you want to produce, you can also learn what is the value of another hour of machine A, for example. From the feedback you get, from the solution that you get, which I'll show you in a minute, you can literally figure out, is it worth paying a guy to work for another hour overtime? How much will I make versus how much it will cost me? Okay? And you can learn that about all of your resources. Not all of them will be constraints. Some of them you have excess. That's also interesting. Okay? You can tell people to go home. Sometimes, for example, in the car industry, they'll close a factory for a month because they figured out that they're better off shutting it down than they are to just keep going with low production levels. So the value of your resources to you is also of interest. Okay, and this is where we've added the slack variables, and they are variables just like decision variables. Okay, and here's what we drew, or wrote out. And these are the points that we were just discussed. Okay, so now we're going to come to a small example, and you're going to write up and maybe even try to solve. Okay, I give you 5 minutes. Don't do it on your own, do it with somebody. Okay, very simple one, but you'll see that it's not so simple to see the answer, even when it's a small example. Okay, So it's called the Gemstone Tool Company, or GTC. It's a real company that's based in Seattle, and it has manufacturing plants across North America. And we're going to look at one plant. Okay? And that one plant, let's say, is considering producing 2 new products, wrenches and pliers. So W's and P's. Or X1, X2, it doesn't matter. Okay, and then you make these wrench and pliers from steel, and for that you have an injection molding machine that creates the different parts, and an assembly machine that puts it together. Okay, very, very simple. And we've even provided all of the data that you need. Okay, so we know how much steel is required to produce 1 ton of each of these products. We know how much time is required in the molding machine and the assembly machine. And we've even got here the total availability of your resources. Okay, that's steel in tons and hours on machines. There is no problem with mixing different units. Solving a problem for multiple different units. You can have a constraint in terms of money, constraint in terms of utilities, happiness indexes, and of course, what have I left out? Money and quantities, okay? As long as, for a specific constraint, the left-hand side matches the right-hand side, okay? So this is what we were doing, for example, when we said P1 plus P2 has got to equal 10 or less than or equal to 10, and we said 1 plus 1, okay? Because we knew that we multiply it by the number of hours needed to produce that, we create from the left-hand side hours that matches the right-hand side. So each constraint has to be for a specific unit. That's the important part. Okay, we also have in our little story demand limitations. Okay, so the marketing department told us we can't sell more than 8,000 wrenches. So don't produce more because there's no point. You won't make money on it. And 10,000 pliers. And here we have the contribution, another way of saying the profit or gross profit for each unit of our product. Okay, and my question to you is, how am I going to maximize my profits? What should I do? And it says, work with your partners to determine the number of wrenches and pliers to produce given these constraints. Okay? And don't cheat and look ahead at the slides, because that would be very boring. Okay, I will go back to here and think about it.
Just like Excel's. Do you think it's too easy? What are the decisions? Yes, no, but what are the decisions in this program? Because this is an equal body. Okay. So, I see some people really advanced and some people still at the back, so it's up to you. How many decision variables do we have?
I just watched your face. How many decision variables do we have? 4. 2. Any other offers?
How many decision variables do we have?
We have somewhere between 2 and 4. How many constraints do we have?
5.
Somebody has 6. We have 7. Okay, we have two decision variables. How many wrenches to produce and how many pliers. Okay, I understand that it's hard to sometimes see what's a constraint and what's a decision. That's why I always say start with thinking about the decisions. What do you want to actually know? Okay, and what we want to know is how much to produce. So I'm going to talk about W's and P's. How many wrenches and how many pliers to produce. Okay. Then we have to figure out the objective function to maximize or to minimize. And in this case, we've been told what's the contribution. Therefore, we're maximizing our profits. And we have 0.4 times W plus 0.3 times P. Okay? And then we have an objective function. And clearly, the answer should be that we want to produce as much W as possible because apparently it's more profitable. Okay. But does that mean to the exclusion of everything else? Well, no, not necessarily. Okay. Constraints. First, we need to think about the steel. Okay, so we know 1.5 and 1.5 times W creates the total amount of steel that we will consume, okay, in producing our W's. And then 1 times the pliers has got to be less than or equal to the 15,000 tons that we have in total. Okay, there's some yeses, that's excellent. Okay, then we have the hour story for each of the machines. So first constraint in tons of steel, second constraint in hours. We have 1 and 1, so we know W plus P got to be less than or equal to the 12,000 hours that we have. So this is constraint 1, this is constraint 2. 3 is on the assembly machine, 0.4 times W plus, what was it, 0.5 times P got to be less than or equal to the 5,000 hours. And what will be interesting here to see is which one of these constraints, or both of them, which ones are strict. And when I say strict, I mean they're defining the optimal solution. So they're defining one of the extreme points. And by defining the extreme point, that means that the slack equals 0. So those are the constraints which will have value to us were we to be given an additional unit. Or, you know, somebody got sick and went home and we actually have less hours than we thought we did, and they're the ones that are going to hurt us. Whereas the constraints with slack means it, okay, never mind, tomorrow will be another day. Fourth constraint. Who wants to give me a fourth constraint? The demand for wrenches. W got to be less than or equal to 8,000. Because if it's more than 8,000, we're not going to make 0.4 on it. Okay? So we're kind of taking into account what would restrict our objective values. And separately, it has to be a separate constraint because the demand on wrenches has got nothing to do with the demand for pliers. Okay? They're completely separate, whereas here they're combining. So P's got to be less than or equal to 10,000. So we said 4, 5, 3, well, I'm lying, 4, 5. I claimed 7. Where are the other 2? Exactly. All of our variables have got to be non-negative. So W is greater than or equal to 0, P is greater than or equal to 0, and we have our 7 constraints. Yes. Okay? And drawing that is a bit of a pain. I did sort of try, but it was a bit miserable. But this is sort of the feasible area, feasible region. And so we have, I don't know, a few extreme points. I probably haven't, my straight lines don't look very straight. I apologize, it's hard on a board. Okay, what I did do was solve it in Excel, and I asked them to upload it for you guys so you can actually see it. It's using Solver. I don't know if you've heard of that. You have. Brilliant. Yeah. So it's you can just add it in, and all we're doing is sum product. Okay, so it's done in the same way that we've just been talking about. So here is the original data, and this is C. These are the parameters in the objective function. This is B. This is the right-hand side of our constraints. Okay, and what you see here in sort of colors is where I messed around with it. This is actually the answer. Okay, after I solved it, I now know that I can make approximately 4,000 units of money by producing just over 7,000 wrenches and 4,000 pliers. This is not something that you would have been able to guess, I imagine. I certainly couldn't have guessed it. Okay, and it's just a two-variable model. Okay, what we can see here is these are the constraints, and this is the right-hand side, and this is actually what we get. So in fact, what we see is that the steel has no slack. We're using up the entire 15,000 tons. This means an additional unit of steel would be useful. Okay, then we see, for example, that the molding machine constraint is not tight. So we've got some slack there we can use for something else. The assembly machines, on the other hand, are very restrictive. This is why one of the reasons we're not producing 8,000 wrenches, which is what we would like to do. Okay, we would like to produce the demand. And we can't because of the lack of steel and the lack of assembly machine hours. So maybe we can take somebody from the molding machine and apply him to the assemblies. Or maybe we want to have a different mix of the machinery that we have. And we want to add some more assembly machines or get something that's faster to speed it up, and so on and so forth. And then we can see, you know, we're not producing the full demand required in the marketplace. Okay, so I have to admit that Solver's cute for little problems. I wouldn't dare solve a real problem doing that. I'm going to use something like MATLAB normally, and then there's a whole lot of commercial solvers out there to solve these problems, like Cplex. That's the standard one that I would use. There's Garobi. There's a whole bunch of programs. If you're working with a consultant, then you can understand at least what they're talking about, because that's what they've done. Okay, so now we get to the assumptions of our model, because it's a model, and there will always be issues with the assumptions. Okay. So first of all, these are the underlying assumptions for a linear program. Okay, it's specific to linear. And we have a proportionality assumption. Okay, which means that every single decision variable has its own contribution to the objective function that stands on its own and that you can define. It might be that if you're producing a few hundred, you're pretty much a price taker in the market, and you know how much you can sell it at. If you're the leading company in the market and you can set the price, then you might be talking about completely different sets of values. You have to appreciate sort of approximately the size of the market that you are trying to discuss. Okay, and this will impact the parameters, the data that you collect. But every single one of your variables has to have its own individual contribution. You can't add a constant. Okay, you can't say plus 10,000. It can only be determined, the objective function can only be determined in terms of each of your decision variables alone. And then you have this additivity assumption, okay, which means that you cannot multiply decision variables. And normally, when I teach an entire course on linear programming and optimization, I always find some students want to say, okay, but W times P. Okay, and that doesn't work because then it's not linear. So for example, you're selling chairs and you're selling tables. And each chair is worth 100 sole and profit, and each table is worth 1,000. But then maybe you want to sell a set, a table and 6 chairs. And maybe then it changes slightly, what your profits are from one unit versus the other. Okay, so how can you handle that? Okay, because you can't multiply them. So then you have to cheat. Okay, in the standard cheat processes, you have a new variable. Okay, so you had A and B, now you have C. And C is going to use up the resources required for one table and 6 chairs and have its own profit function, contribution to the profit. Okay, so we have proportionality and we have additivity in a linear program. And then we have a divisibility assumption. So this means exactly what you saw here. We did not produce 7,000 wrenches. We produced 7,142.86. Okay? It's a continuous number. The only constraint that we had was that it is not negative. And that's okay. For most problems, that's not an issue. So you're going to produce the 142nd this week and the other 0.86 next week. Nothing will happen. Okay? When you're talking about small items. If you're talking to Boeing or Airbus, okay, producing 1.5 aircraft is not the same as 1 or 2. Well, they cost 100 million a pop, right? Let's be honest. Okay, so in that case, you can't use linear programming anymore, and you have to go to integer programming. And what's the difference between integer and linear programming? Integer. So it has to be 1 or 2 or 3. It can't be a half. You've changed the feasible space. Okay? It's no longer continuous and pretty. Nah, we don't like that anymore. That's horrible. Okay, because mathematically you can't solve that. So actually the whole process is solved using linear programming, and you start carving up the feasible space until you find a solution that in fact gives you integer outcomes. This is so beyond MP hard I can't even describe it. And sometimes, you know, a problem with 10 variables you can't solve. But on the other side, it's very useful because it does tend to describe some of the situations that we want to talk about. And I mean, I have personally solved some problems with, say, 40, 50,000 integer variables. We were looking, for example, at where to place, I don't know if you're going to shoot me for this, traffic police cars. Okay? They have quite a lot of jobs. One of them is to be conspicuous and to sit on the side of the road and for people to be aware that, you know, if you're speeding, or even worse, of course, crossing a white line or through a traffic light, which I understand does happen here, okay, you will be caught and you will be fined or lose your license and so on. They have other jobs, you know, they have to go solve if there's been an accident, maybe help out and so on and so forth. And we were trying to figure out where to place these cars to maximize their conspicuousness, given also all the other constraints that they have on a shift basis over a year. And so we took the whole road network and we made it into nodes. Every node is say 50 meters, and make a decision about where they are, because you don't want them to sit in the same place every day. There's something called a halo effect, and drivers remember, and then so you don't need to put the car there again for a few weeks until people forget, and then you have to put it back. Okay, so you can solve these kinds of problems, and quite large ones sometimes, but sometimes integer programs are very difficult. Therefore, linear, if you can do it, linear is always going to be better. And finally, we have this certainty assumption. We know our C's, we know our B's, we know the A's, we know how to build, and we know the numbers. We are sure of those numbers. We can't solve it without them. Okay? And then there's a whole bunch of people that try to do things like fuzzy logic and all sorts of interesting things. Mostly what you would do is sensitivity analysis. At what point would you stop producing ventures? Okay, push it to the extremes. If you're really made a mistake about profitability and it was to go down, because normally up is okay, but down is an issue. If it comes down by 20, 30%, would you stop producing entirely? How would it impact your results? Okay, so 4 sets of very serious assumptions lying behind all of your models. Okay. So I'm done with trying to explain linear programming, except for one other point that I should make, because it's very useful for the DEA that we're going on to talk about now. Okay. For every model that we develop in a linear program, we're actually solving 2 problems at the same time. So it's called the primal and the dual. So for every profit maximization model that we've developed and that we solved here, there's actually a dual model that we're solving at the same time that's minimizing something. Okay? And it's actually minimizing, in fact, resource usage. If we maximize profits, we're going to minimize the uses of the hours and the steel and so on. And why is that useful? That's useful to give us the dual prices. It is useful to give us information about the values of our resources. And in the DEA world, what we're going to do is use this model to estimate weights. Just like we talked about yesterday, how are we going to come up with the weights to combine the different inputs and outputs that we talked about? Okay, that's on one side. And on the other side, we want to know who our benchmarks are when we're being inefficient. So the weights are the primal solution, and who the benchmarks are is our dual solution. And we're solving this at the same time. So even in Excel Solver, if you're running it, you will get both the value of your variables, your decision variables and your slacks from your primal solution, and you'll also get dual prices, the values of all of your resources, as an output from the model. Okay? Cool. So, how much time do we have left for this class? We have another 15 minutes. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to open up the slides for the next class, and what we're going to do from the last class is talk about the homework. So I'm hoping that you had some time to work on this. Would that be reasonable? Yeah, you found some time to think about this? Good, thank you. Okay. So I suggested that you start to think about a problem that would be of interest or typical inputs and outputs for performance measure of or bus companies or farms or even high-tech firms. Okay, so who would like to start? Jorge is the only person willing to talk? Okay, okay, so you start. Go for it.
Okay, we took one of high-tech. So we were thinking that it would be interesting to measure for the amount of incident reports as an output. Yes, as an output or indicator. Okay, I'm a high-tech firm. I produce some kind of service or software or anything.
Okay, this is an important point, right? So before you even start listing variables, first of all, you have to think about from whose perspective am I thinking about this question? Okay, you could think about it from the consumer's perspective. You could think about it from the company perspective or from a regulator, and every single one of these is going to be different. And that's point number one. Point number two is it short term? Are you looking for what's going to happen next month? Are you thinking long-term strategy? So the next couple of years, or 5, because you're about to go to a VC, angel, or bank to figure out who's going to give you money to keep going, for example. And then the other question I would ask is, how did you think about this? What did you do to come up with this list? And you just talked, or perhaps you opened Wikipedia, not my favorite, okay, or a book or a paper. Because if you remember, how did I start all of this? I say, okay, so this paper has got like 25,000 citations. Never start from nothing. You know, why reinvent the wheel? Go look to see that I'm sure some of it is in Spanish. Okay, go see what other people have done. It gives you ideas. It's not necessarily the right way to do it. When you read it, it's not the Bible. Okay, but at least it will give you a good start. So now I'll shut up and Jorge will carry on.
Okay, so we took the heritage company. We were looking from, we tried to look at both sides from the company point of view and from the client. So one of our first performance measures that we were thinking to measure is one related growth, is the amount of incidents reports. Okay, so what's the general idea? If I'm providing a good service, I should have the lowest or the minimal number of incidents in a certain period of time. Going on the same line, we were thinking, okay, if there are going to be incidents, how much time it takes for us to fix them or answer them. So the incident resolve time is also an important measure. We have also said because both of them are for outputs, we believe in that way. If we are looking at this from the point of demand or how well we are doing the business, we would like to measure the amount of license sold or amount of downloads of our products. Okay. From another perspective, okay, going inside from the company, maybe it would be interesting to measure the amount of complete projects we have.
The number of sprints.
Well, if we are talking about agile, yes, we will work in that way. Number of sprints. How many developers I have in the company.
Okay, so we're kind of mixing stuff up here, right? Yeah, so we've got inputs and we've got outputs, and we have no choice. We have to decide which they are. Yeah? Okay, cool. So inputs are generally fairly similar. Not always, fairly similar. The magic word here is input is something you want to minimize, and output normally is something you want to maximize. The rule of thumb. Okay. So your inputs, if you think about the Clem's model, capital, labor, energy, materials, supplies. Okay? So you said number of developers. Absolutely. So we could talk about number of full-time equivalent developers, programmers, whatever, as compared to ancillary staff. I don't know if they have a lot of ancillary staff, but let's assume that they do for a minute, and they're going to be earning different salaries. You might have management. You might want to separate that. Yeah. Okay. So that would be your labor. Capital. How much capital is invested in these companies? Okay, and how are we going to measure it, and so on and so forth. Maybe we could look at the space that they have. So square footage of space at WeWorks or whatever it is that they're using. Okay, but we need to think about some sort of measure for the capital invested in this firm. It might be money, so you're looking at what the angels or the VCs have invested. As long as it's comparable and you can do it, say, over time or with other companies in the same currencies, that's okay. So space, or dollars. Energy, materials and supplies, basically, you know, you have to buy some software. Maybe I was at Mobileye last week, they complained that they have to spend $60,000 on space in the cloud on a monthly basis. These are the automated car guys, yes, so they have a lot of video that they need to keep and so on. Okay, so all other expenses. And if travel is a big deal, then maybe you would want to separate it and so on and so forth. Okay, and then for the output, this is far more complicated, I think. Because what is the output? I mean, it would be nice to just include profits. Yeah? Okay, so that would be nice. Not all of these companies are actually earning money, so it depends on which stage they are in the process. But clearly, yeah, money. And now we get to, say, number of projects that they're involved in, or number of products that they're producing. Maybe, I don't know if you know how to count that. And it would have to be projects that have been completed. Or what the number of hours that were involved in it, something that you can measure. Okay, and then we have the last one I just wanted to talk about, number of incident reports. So this is where customers have tried to use Waze and it got stuck, or it stopped working, or they pissed you off this morning, so you write a rude letter to them. Is this something you necessarily want to maximize? Okay, so if it's something you want to minimize, does that mean it's an input? You see, this is one of the major issues here is you have to remember we have a production process. It might be a black box, but this is our process. So this is our high-tech company. And it has a bunch of inputs, and it's producing a bunch of outputs. Okay. And are incident reports an input to this story? Hell no. It's coming out of the fact that somebody's used our service, which is a good thing, right? But then it's failed to work. So you have to think very carefully. I think it's more a philosophical question. Some people, without even thinking, would just stick it in as an input. Personally, I would put it as an output, but then you have to think about how you measure it, because it's actually something you want to minimize, and if you leave it along with all the outputs, you are going to end up maximizing it, which is not good. So you need to do the reciprocal of it, or the negative value, or think about the other side of the story to make it something positive so that you can include it as an output and still in the right direction. I'm sorry? For example, and to make it into something positive. There's a lot of text mining and data mining going on, and normally they count -1s and +1s. So how often a company appears on the internet in a positive or negative manner, and you'll add it up and create an index, for example. Absolutely. So I want to leave some time for you guys. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and which did you use? Farms. Absolutely. You want to stick your computer in? Go for it. That's it, yes. So, is that good?
the other input are animals, in this case, chickens. The other inputs are the equipment, the heaters, drinkers, another fountains, because these are the kind of things that chickens needs to live in this farm. The next things, as you say, teacher, are the farmers, the vets, and the zootechnics. We thought about vaccines and food supplements for the chickens.
We consider that they are the most important inputs. Now, we have the outputs.
The outputs are the animals, the chickens, because here in Peru you can buy live chickens in the markets, chicken in pieces, or processed chicken, and chicken fertilizer.
The more relevant variables in inputs is feed, yes, workforce, poultry equipment, and output meat, chicken. Next, actually in Peru, per capita consumption in chicken is 5.1 kilos per person. Yes. Is full. Other date is the protein more important in nutrition of Peruvian is chicken. No? Actually, days production chicken is 42 days actually. Conversion food is what consumer feed for producing meat.
They are the reason that support our idea.